Good evening.
Picking up a little bit where we left off, a little quick reminder in case you had a real long lunch and didn't talk about it like I was supposed to. All right, a few things I want us to kind of touch on. The problem was, if you can remember, the problem was that they had lost focus of their own goal, or the thing that they were set out to do. As God's people, they had a responsibility to God to represent or to show the world God and to show them what He means. And if you think about it, we have the same responsibility today. We bear the name of Christ. We walk around with the name Christian all the time, and we're to show the world what God looks like, what love and mercy and care looks like, what justice looks like. And the problem that they were facing in that moment is that they had focused so much on the sacrifices or so much on the laws of the Sabbath that they had forgotten about why these things were even put in place in the first place, why they were even there to begin with, so to speak. And so as we continue on with this, what he says in verse 7 is probably the pinnacle point of the lesson in Matthew chapter 12. That probably the most important part of understanding what is going on here in Matthew chapter 12. In verse 7, he says, "If you would have known what this means, that I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." He does multiple things within this instance. Of course, the latter half of the verse, he is showing that they had done nothing wrong. You would not have condemned the guiltless, those who are without guilt. But at the same time, he starts off the phrase with something that sounds very similar to what he has said in times past, but also very different in many ways as well. He says, if you had known what this means. Now, he says this in other ways throughout Scripture. Typically the way you see it is, have you not read? In fact, he's going to even use that one as well. Have you not read? Do you not understand? Have you not grasped these things? Now remember, this is the Son of God in the flesh, born into the Jewish belief system, speaking to Pharisees, who were the Jewish leaders and the Jewish scholars, about a day that was to be set apart and focused on by the Jewish people, the Sabbath. So he's speaking to them about stuff that they would understand, but yet he's saying, you don't understand it. That's the problem. You claim to understand it because you claim that to understand Sabbath is to understand the following of everything to a T, is to understand the law to a T. And while that is a part of Sabbath, he wants them to understand the main focus of the Sabbath was to have a day where you dedicated it back to God, a day where you did not worry about the things of this world, and a day that you focused on His love and His care and His mercy. But in so doing, because they had focused so much on the love, so much on the law of the Sabbath, they forgot about the purpose or the foundation of the Sabbath, which was God and His will. Now, we mentioned a little bit the ideas that happen in Exodus 29, Leviticus 19, and Isaiah chapter 1. And we talked about how each of these kind of tie in together, because one hand you've got the law that says don't eat the showbread. The other law you says take care of those who are in need. In fact, it's not the only place we could look in the Old Testament. We're going to look at a couple in the New Testament to kind of couple with that in a second. But then Isaiah chapter 1 says, okay, the problem is that you focus so much on these following after each little law that you've forgotten the purpose, Isaiah 1, and therefore the following of those laws have become repulsive to me. They've become disgusting to me. Now, what can we learn from just that lesson alone, right there? If we do not understand why we do things for God, they become empty and they become vain. They did not understand why they were sacrificing or why they were put on this earth. So as a result, their sacrifices were vain. They were empty. Same way we've been talking about it a little bit on Sunday morning Bible class about our prayers. If we don't understand why we say certain things and we just say them in a repetitive nature, they become empty and vain. Same thing goes with their sacrifices. They focus so much on the law that they forgot the purpose or the foundation of why they even do these things in the first place. We left off a little bit in verse 5 and 6 as he begins to talk about the priest profaning the temple. And one of the things I mentioned was if the priesthood can work on the Sabbath as a servant of the temple, can't the one who is greater than the temple also work on the Sabbath, especially if it's a fulfillment of the law of love and of care? Now, the words mentioned, if you would have known, in verse 7. Once again, this is a quote from Hosea chapter 6:6. But those words there in verse 7, if you would have known, is their problem, is they did not know. You ever been embarrassed because you think you know something and you learn you don't? Ain't much more humble. You know that old phrase, that Bible quotation there, the proud will be made humble? Yeah, there's a reason for it. There's a reason why Jesus says, don't take the seat at the head of the table. Don't get on a platform, because it's a long walk back down when one greater than you comes. He's saying, Pharisees, you don't get it. You don't understand this. Now remember, these are people whose jobs are to understand and meditate upon and learn the laws of the Old Testament. And He's telling them, you don't understand. Okay? Just like you would imagine, they're not too happy about that statement. But He follows it up with the action that should have taken place. Second half of verse 7. If you had understood what this meant, if you did understand what it means to desire mercy rather than sacrifice, then you would understand why you were in the wrong, or you would not have even spoken out against or condemned those who are guiltless. And then He continues that with for the Son of Man is Lord of Sabbath. Okay, verse 9. He leaves that area, and now He goes into the synagogue, which would be common practice on the Sabbath. He goes into the synagogue, and be reminded, what did He just said about the priests in the temple? Or those who were in the synagogues and stuff like that? What are they doing? They're working on the Sabbath. So now He's going into that synagogue, which He has spoken against or spoken about. And a man comes to Him with a withered hand. And they asked Him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He said to them, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. When He said these things, He told the man to stretch out his hand. The man did so, and it was made healthy like the other. And the Pharisees conspired against Him on how to destroy Him. Okay, a few interesting things about this moment. I'm going to keep referencing Sunday morning Bible class. If you missed it, it's on the live stream. Go back and watch it, because we talked about a lot of this stuff. Remember the verse about the 2 sparrows worth a penny? How much more value does God give to man? Okay, this is a similar instance. He's saying, you got a sheep, a part of your flock. They fall into a ditch. Are you going to wait until the Sabbath is over, until sun is down, to go and get that sheep? No. You're going to show mercy to that sheep, and you're going to get it out of the ditch or out of the hole. Why? Because that's your livelihood. That's something of value unto you. And He says, if you do that to a sheep, how much more valuable is a man? Or we might say, how much more valuable is a soul? See, once again, this is a problem. They're having a problem with Jesus healing a man of an illness, and yet they will go out and go get a sheep out of the ditch. And there's their problem there. They focus on the law until it's like, well, that's my sheep. If it was your sheep, hey, you're in the wrong. But it's my sheep, so I can't let it die in the ditch. I got to go get it. This is a man who has an infirmity of a withered hand. And Jesus says, of how much more value is a man than a sheep? Notice the question that is asked in verse 10. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Here's where things get a little bit interesting for Jesus' response to them. The question is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But look at Jesus' response in verse 12. He doesn't say, so it is lawful to do good, to heal on the Sabbath. He said, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Their question was it lawful to heal? His answer was, it was lawful to do good. Now, here's the thing. There's a reason why he answers with the phrase, do good. Because in Jewish literature, the idea of do good is an act of benevolence, which would include things like healing. So for a Jew to do good was for a Jew to practice benevolence or mercy or show a great deal of love. We see instances of this in places like Galatians chapter 6:10. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, especially to those who are of the household of faith. as well as in James chapter 4 and verse 17. Whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. So when he says the phrase, it is lawful for us to, or for you to do good on the Sabbath, he's saying it's lawful for you to show benevolence. If there's somebody in need, you don't go, oh, too bad, it's the Sabbath. I would make you some more bread, but you caught me on the wrong day of the week. Come see me tomorrow, and if you live that long, I'll give you some bread. He said, if somebody is in need, you help them. It's just plain and simple. Somebody is hungry, you feed the starving. Somebody in this instance, with Jesus' power, has the ability to help a man who has this infirmity. He can heal them of it. And he's saying, you put more value on your sheep and on your livestock than you do another soul, another man. And that's their problem. They're so blinded by the law that they have devalued human life. We understand how horrible the devaluation of human life can become. What horrible things can happen when someone no longer sees the value in the human life. And that's their problem. They were valuing their livestock more than they were their fellow man. They're valuing their possessions more than they were the souls of those who are around them. And so when God says to them back in verse 7, or when Jesus says to them back in verse 7, if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, this whole situation would have been avoided. Had they understood God's real and true intention for man is to show mercy and to show love and to help those who are in need, and this would have not been a problem at all. But they did not understand, and that's where the problem comes in. So he says in verse 12, of how much more valuable is a man than a sheep? It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Now here's where it gets real interesting. I know I've said that 3 times, but it's just a really interesting passage, all right? You look at 1 Kings chapter 13, which is way out of left field for us. But you got to remember, there's a Jewish audience being spoken to by a Jewish man, and that Jewish audience is a group of Jewish scholars. So when he references something in 1 Kings chapter 13, they're going to understand what he's talking about. And in 1 Kings 13, what you see is you see Jeroboam seeking to take hold or entrap the man of God. Does that sound familiar to maybe what's happening in Matthew chapter 12? The Pharisees are seeking to entrap the man of God, Jesus. Jeroboam is seeking to entrap the man of God, and he stretches out his hand to point the finger and to pronounce judgment or a curse upon him. And what happens to Jeroboam's hand? It withers. So notice, Jeroboam is seeking to entrap the man of God, and as a result, his hand becomes withered. Matthew chapter 12, instead of Jesus withering up somebody's hand, what does he do? He heals the man with the withered hand. This is another example of Jesus showing the true nature of God. He is showing them in this instance that the God of man, the Son of God, is a God that shows love and mercy and care. Let me ask you this. Could Jesus have withered all the hands of every Pharisee in the room at that time? Absolutely, without a doubt, and would have every right to do so. Yet what he did is, instead of pronouncing judgment upon them, he showed mercy. See how that goes back to Hosea 6:6 and Matthew 12 verse 7? He desires mercy and not sacrifice. Jesus withheld judgment from them at that moment because He was allowing for them to see their own foolishness. He was allowing for them to see their own problems. He didn't condemn any of the Pharisees for questioning Him. He simply started them down the path of where they thought about it themselves and realized, you know what? Yeah, we've done wrong. Sadly, they didn't realize that though. Notice in Matthew chapter 12, instead of pronouncing an infirmity against them, He shows them mercy, which is what He was trying to get them to understand all along, that He desires mercy rather than sacrifice. God's desire is that we have mercy before sacrifice, justice before ritual obedience. However, justice is a form of obedience to the law. We talked about those weightier passages or those weightier parts of the law. In fact, a look at Matthew chapter 23. You'll see that he talks a little bit about these weightier things of the law. in Matthew 23. If I can get it to open. There we go. Matthew chapter 23. A whole chapter of pronouncements of woe. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, this, that, and the other. All these moments where he's saying, here's all the things you're doing wrong. You need to correct these things. You need to get right. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, beginning in Matthew 23:23. And hypocrites, you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. It's a little bit of a weird way of saying, you're so messed up. You've got everything all wrong. What was their focus in that instance in Matthew 23? Hey, great. You're tithing your cumin and your dill and your mint. That's awesome. All the while, you're forgetting about justice and mercy and faithfulness. And as a result, God calls them hypocrites. He pronounces woe upon them, a way of warning them of a coming destruction. He said, these things you ought to have done without the neglecting of others. I don't think it takes a two-part sermon for us to understand that sometimes our minds get mixed up on the wrong things. Sometimes we focus on the wrong parts of God's Word. He says, it's great that you can do these things like offer sacrifices. It's great even that they could do things like tithe their mint and their dill and their cumin. That's fantastic. But because you have done so while neglecting justice and mercy and love, these things have become absolutely repulsive. They have become vain and empty and pointless. They had lost focus on the purpose and the plot of Sabbath. And as a result, they stand in the face of the Lord of Sabbath and tell Him how He is Sabbathing wrong. Tell Him how He is doing His own day wrong. And His response is very simple. It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. They asked a very simple question. Is it lawful? And He says, yes, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Now, you might go, okay, Case, fantastic, absolutely wonderful. We don't have to Sabbath. So what in the world does this mean to us? Well, there's no point behind us focusing on the purpose of Sabbath because we don't live under the old law. We're not commanded to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. So what does this mean to us? Let's be careful that our focus doesn't become so legalistic that we forget, and so ritualistic that we forget about why we are here in the first place. There are countless, I'm sure somebody's counted, but we'll use the phrase countless. There are countless moments in the New Testament where we are given commands to do things. But when asked what is the greatest commandment, Jesus' response is very simple. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. If we forget to do those two things, everything else that we do is going to be absolutely pointless. If we do not have a love for God that drives us to do whatever He may ask of us, if we don't have a love for our neighbor that we're willing to sacrifice, even unto the point of our own shortcomings, then maybe we need to reevaluate our love for our neighbor. When looking at the phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, that automatically takes out whether or not you're going to value your sheep more than you are your brother. Because a love for your neighbor as yourself means that I'm going to love God with the best of my ability, and I'm going to love those around me more than I care about my own self. That means when your sheep is in the ditch and there's a brother in need, you're going to go to the brother in need rather to the sheep that is in the ditch. Coincidentally, Jesus called us sheep because He understood that sometimes we were going to be in the ditch. And He understood that even on a day that like Sabbath, that mercy is required in order for us to be pleasing in His sight. If you're here this afternoon and you have not been showing mercy the way that God has required or asked of us to show mercy, I'm not going to encourage you, I'm going to warn you. A lack of showing mercy means a lack of mercy shown. You stand today in present time without a love and commitment to those who are around you. Don't be surprised when on the day of judgment you stand before God who shows no mercy because you failed to do so. Maybe you are surrounded by people who you judge, and therefore when you stand before God on Judgment Day, you're going to be judged with the same measure that you have placed on them. Or maybe, hopefully, You look at your neighbor and value them as much, if not more, than yourself. And you strive to do better by them and show justice and love and mercy. Injustice is never a word that should be used to describe the people of God. We should always seek to do justice. And that means especially as it pertains to doing right by somebody who is in need. God asks for mercy to be shown and love to be shown because it is something that He has already shown us. And if you're here this afternoon and you have never received that mercy or that love through baptism or through repentance or through forgiveness, I encourage you not to leave here today without receiving that wonderful gift and then going out and showing it to others. If there's any way that we can help you, please come while we stand and while we sing.